Hey, 42 here. Sometimes everything just seems to go your way. You head out on your morning commute to find the roads inexplicably empty. You buy a coffee and the cashier accidentally gives you too much change. You meet your Tinder date and despite your rock bottom expectations, she turns out to not have a face like scrambled eggs. On days like this, you're King Midas, jabbing everything in sight and giggling madly as it turns into gold. You're Harry Potter with a belly full of Felix Felicis, catching snitches and hexing fools. For mere mortals like you and me, days like these might be memorable, but most of the time they have no real lasting impact. To a professional athlete, however, a day when everything just goes right could be life-changing. This is probably the reason so many sports stars have weird and wonderful superstitions and pre-game routines. It's said that Serena Williams wears the exact same pair of socks for every game during a tennis tournament, and Michael Jordan always wore a pair of powder blue University of North Carolina shorts under his Chicago Bulls kit. Rumour has it this is actually the reason modern basketball players wear such long and baggy shorts today. Michael Jordan set the trend in order to cover up his lucky charms, in more ways than one, and it caught on. But why would superstars of this magnitude bother with silly rituals? The answer to that question would probably make up a pretty good doctoral thesis, but I think part of it is simple. No matter how good you are, you're always striving after that magical day when the whistle blows or the starter gun fires, and for a few brief minutes, you're perfect. If that means wearing a lucky pair of shorts or cultivating new strains of bacteria in your socks, then so be it. During the Olympic Games in Mexico City in 1968, a young athlete named Bob Beamon from New York had one of those rare, perfect days, and in doing so, did something that is considered by many to be the single greatest accomplishment in the history of athletics. An achievement so stunning it spawned a brand new word, Beamonesque. That sport historians use to this day to describe sporting feats that are so incredible as to be almost unbelievable. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here. The Mexico Summer Olympics were the first to be held in Latin America and the first to be televised in colour around the world. It's fair to say, expectations were high, and the games did not disappoint. Looking back, the Mexico Games are probably best remembered for the protest of African American athletes Tommy Smith and John Carlos. The pair had won gold and bronze respectively in the 200 metres, and each raised a black-gloved fist during their medal ceremony as the American national anthem played to protest against racial inequality in the US at the time. Away from the politics, a young George Foreman was busy battling his way to boxing gold a year before turning professional. Dick Fosbury won gold in the high jump whilst pioneering the flop technique that people swore blind would never catch on, and badass John Stephen Aquari crossed the finish line over an hour behind the winner in the marathon. The reason for his terrible time? He dislocated his knee whilst jockeying for position less than halfway through the 26-mile race. Yet, he still managed to finish. The Mexico Games also saw the first ever Olympic doping disqualification after regulations and testing were brought in for the first time. I'm guessing you're thinking the culprit, Swede Hans-Gunnar Ligenwall, was found to have taken steroids or was perhaps partial to a side of EPO with his dinner. Not even close. The Pan-athlete and certified lad was actually disqualified for knocking back a couple of cheeky pints before the pistol shooting event. Because, you know, guns and alcohol are a great combo. But in amongst all this chaos and competition, it was in the long jump final where one of sport's greatest ever achievements would take place. To say Bob Beamon had had a rough childhood would be something of an understatement. Born in 1946 in Queens, New York, Beamon's mother died of tuberculosis before his first birthday, and the man he thought to be his father until the age of 17 turned out to have actually been in prison at the time of Beamon's conception. Bob spent much of his childhood bouncing around various relatives' houses, poverty hot on his heels. Perhaps unsurprisingly, he had a tough time of it in school, earning himself expulsion from kindergarten for turning up to show and tell with a switchblade and a 38mm Smith & Wesson. Not quite the half-chewed cuddly toy and kick-ass marble collection that I remember from my own childhood. By his teenage years, Beamon had fallen in with some bad dudes, rising to the position of war counsellor for the local gang, the Frenchmen. In his own words, he was out of control. As the old cliche goes, it was sport that saved him, entering a nearby competition on something of a whim. 15-year-old Beamon jumped 7 meters 34 centimeters in winning the long jump event, and got his name published in the newspaper for his troubles. It was to be the catalyst for a truly remarkable career. By the time the Mexico Olympics rolled round in '68, Beamon was 22, already the American long jump and triple jump champion. He had a personal best in the long jump of 8 meters 33 centimeters, the second longest distance ever leapt. Unfortunately for him, the two men who'd gone further were also competing in Mexico City. Joint world record holders Ralph Boston, who was Beamon's teammate, and the gold medalist from the Rome Olympics in 1960, and Soviet competitor Igor Ovanessian. These two spring-heeled mavericks had dominated long jump over the previous decade, breaking the world record 8 times between them, and stretching the limit of unaided human flight by 14 centimeters in that time. Boston and Ovanessian had both been on the podium in Tokyo 4 years before, and the gold medalist from that year, a Welshman with the Welshiest of names, Lynn Davies, or Lynn the Leap to his buddies, was also competing. It was fair to say Beamon had his work cut out for him, but his competitors were also more than a little wary in return. Ralph Boston is said to have told Davies not to try and get in Beamon's head in the run-up to the event, with a warning that, in hindsight, was oddly prophetic.
Don't get him riled up, Lynn, else he's liable to jump out the fucking pit.
Thanks to a stunning run of form leading up to the Mexico Games, which saw him win 22 of his previous 23 competitions, Beamon was actually seen by the bookmakers as a narrow favourite for the event, despite the pedigree of his competitors. But Bob was inexperienced at this level, and it nearly cost him as he fouled his first 2 jumps in qualifying. One more mistake and he'd have been heading home with nothing more to show for his troubles than a pocket full of sand. On his third jump, he measured his run up from well behind the board, nailed a legal jump, and qualified for the final in second place behind Boston. The night before the final, Beamon was a bag of nerves. Perhaps taking inspiration from fellow Olympian Hans Gunnar Ligenwall, who we heard from earlier, Bob knocked back a couple of tequilas to steady the nerves. For most people, working up a stonking hangover before the biggest day of your life would probably be a bad idea. For Bob Beamon, it worked a treat. Next morning, standing at the end of the runway, Bob was deep in the zone. He paused for a full 20 seconds, breathing deeply and shaking out his limbs. Shifting his stance, he took a few deep breaths, rocked back and forth on his heels, then set off down the track like a streak of lightning. The guy was fast. He could run the 100-yard dash, the oldie worldy slightly shorter version of the 100 meters, in 9.8 seconds. Bob hit the board with an audible crack and flew into the air. Understandably, we think of long jumpers as jumping a long way horizontally, but that morning in Mexico, Beamon was high. According to Olympic legend and previous long jump world record holder Jesse Owens, who was commentating for radio at the time, he might have been 6 feet off the ground at the apex of his jump. Bob seemed to hang in the air for a long time before landing almost out of the pit. It quickly became clear this was a big jump, mostly because the high-tech optical measuring device introduced for the Mexico Games didn't extend far enough to actually measure the jump. The reason for this was simple. Nobody thought it was possible for a human being to jump that far. The final had to be suspended for a full 20 minutes, whilst officials rummaged around in some nearby cupboards in search of a tape measure. During the wait, the other competitors could be seen speculating as to just how far Beamon had got. Back then, most of them were used to distances being recorded in feet and inches. The world record at the time was 27 feet 4 3/4 inches, and there were whispers that Beamon's jump was so huge he might have become the first man in history to break the 28 feet mark. Trusty low-tech tape measure in hand, the officials got down and dirty in the sandpit to measure his jump. After a nerve-wracking wait, the results were in. As it turned out, Bob Beamon had indeed become the first man in history to break the 28 feet mark. And that alone would have been enough to see wild celebrations erupt in the stadium. But something much more miraculous had just happened, because Bob had also become the first man in history to break the 29 feet mark. He'd smashed a world record by an almost inconceivable 55 centimeters, almost 2 feet, in a single jump. To put that into perspective, since records began in 1901, no long jumper had beaten the previous record by more than 15 centimeters, and the average increase during that time was less than 6 centimeters. Or to compare Beamon's record to another discipline, the fastest 100 meters in history is 9.58 seconds, run by Usain Bolt in 2008. Beamon improved the long jump world record by more than 6% in one go, which would be the equivalent of someone lowering Bolt's 100 meters time to 8.95 seconds today. It took Bob a minute or two to realise what he'd done. His distance had flashed up on the board at 8 meters 90. It wasn't until his old pal Ralph Boston explained Bob had jumped over 29 feet that it really hit home. Beamon was so overwhelmed his legs collapsed underneath him as he suffered a cataleptic shock, a complete loss of muscle strength brought on by extreme emotion. It would be several minutes before he would be able to walk again. Defending champion Lynn Davies summed things up pretty nicely when he walked over to Beamon in disbelief moments later and said simply, "You have destroyed this event." Unsurprisingly, nobody got close to Beamon's jump that day in Mexico City. East German Klaus Beer came in second place, his jump coming in a gaping 71 centimeters shorter. More than 50 years later, nobody has jumped further in the Olympics than Bob Beamon. In fact, it's the longest held Olympic record by far. Sergei Litinyov's hammer throw from the Seoul Games came close, and that was set a full 20 years after Beamon's incredible jump. Beamon's shadow has hung over the sport ever since, even over Bob himself. It would be 12 years before anyone would even break the 28 feet mark for a second time, let alone 29. And Beamon never landed another jump remotely close to his own record. Not only did he never manage a jump of 29 feet for the rest of his life, he never even managed 27. It was, quite simply, a freak event. A magical day when everything went right for one man. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then please consider supporting me on Patreon because it really helps me to continue to make these videos. The link's in the description. Also, you can get your hands on a first edition signed copy of my new book, Stick a Flag in It, by heading on over to Unbound Publishing, the link's in the description, and pre-ordering your copy today. Thank you.